So let me just summarize this idea. And it's a teaching in the sense that a good teaching is pithy and is something you can think about forever. So a teaching, for instance, from the narrative world would be Jerome Bruner saying, fact is artifact. Anybody ever hear that before? So that's a good teaching, because it's something you can think about forever. My Aboriginal version of that comes from an elder who said, facts are poop. And what he meant by that is that, as I mentioned, I think I talked about this on Thursday night, he meant that when you make statements and present them as facts, that it's sort of like looking at deer droppings. It doesn't really tell you a lot about the life of a deer, or even what it looks like. It might tell you something about what it eats, but probably if a deer walked by and you'd never seen a deer and all you'd looked at is its poop, you wouldn't know that it was a deer. You wouldn't know that that's what made that poop unless you saw it coming out. So, and then you'd have to look at the deer and not the poop to figure that out. So what he meant was, what really matters is the process and not the facts. And that was Jerome Bruner's point of view too, is that what really matters is the narrative, the story, and not the individual facts within the narrative. So let me think of an example. What's a movie that everybody's seen recently? I know. How many of you saw Lambs and Lions? Anyone see that? I like that movie. Nobody saw that but me. Okay. How about The Wizard of Oz? Is anyone who hasn't seen The Wizard of Oz? All right. So a fact would be Dorothy came from Kansas, right? Well, that's actually sort of arbitrary, because she could have come from Nebraska. She could have come from Alabama. She would have had to have a different accent from Alabama, but she didn't actually have a Kansas accent anyway. So she had a Hollywood accent. so that would be a fact. Dorothy came from Kansas. The witch melted when water was poured on her. But that doesn't capture the ambience of the movie at all. It doesn't capture the dramatic moments. It doesn't capture how you feel when those flying monkeys, pick up Dorothy and her friends, and it doesn't capture the feeling of realizing that the wizard is a fake. He's a faker instead of a fakir. It doesn't capture the joy that you feel watching the movie. It doesn't capture what really matters about the movie. So Bruner's point is that any declarative statement is fairly uninteresting. It's just an artifact because it's taken out of a story, and it's kind of pointless. So what matters is the story itself, and not only the story but your interaction with the story. So what if we thought about illness in that way? What if we thought about illness as a movie? And this is getting close to my reconstruction of Aboriginal views of illness. So if however you're suffering is a movie, then what can we say about it? We can say that, well, probably we can't restrict the movie to a description of your symptoms. we must include a lot more about your context. Imagine if you were going to make a movie about your illness. Let's say, does anybody here have a pain? Is there anyone here that has a pain? Okay. Is anyone here who suffers occasionally? Yeah. So imagine if you were going to make a movie about your suffering and your pain. It would, if you sat down to think about it, it would have to be a movie about your life, wouldn't it? Could you imagine making a movie about your suffering and pain without telling about yourself? You'd have to contextualize yourself, right? You'd have to present yourself in an environment. And you'd have to have other characters, either described or present. You'd have to have other actors. You could do it as a monologue, but you would still end up talking about other people. There would be other people involved in the story of your suffering and pain. And there would be some plot. It wouldn't just be random facts. If you wanted to communicate to me, if you wanted to show me your suffering, if you wanted to tell me about your suffering, there would be some sense of plot, like there would be a time before you suffered, most likely, because you probably weren't born suffering, though I understand that Stan Groff thinks that you are. But you probably weren't born suffering. You probably acquired this particular suffering or pain. At some point in your life, you acquired it. So there's a beginning, and there's a story, there's a vignette about that beginning. So and then if you're going to explain this to me, you'd have to pull out more vignettes that were representative. You couldn't tell me about every moment of your suffering and pain. You'd have to be selective. You would have to pick some vignettes that would really make it come alive for me. Like, well, I got this, I'm thinking of when I had a knee problem in December. And I would start off by saying, I think my problem began when I overdid it on the treadmill, and probably I had a little virus at the same time in my knee, and it blossomed forth to be twice its usual size, and it hurt. And then, so that's the beginning of my vignette. That's my first vignette. And then my second vignette would be, and while it was hurting, I went to New York City, and I took a train to Chappaqua, and they didn't call out my stop, and suddenly the doors opened, and I saw the sign, and I remembered how little time the doors stay open on Metro North. And so I grabbed my stuff and twisted my knee, and boy did it hurt, and I couldn't walk on it. So there's vignette number 2. Do you see how it's more interesting when you put in details like Metro North and the place and how quickly the doors open and close on Metro North? And mostly when you tell a story, you do that. All of us are natural storytellers, because that's what it means to be human, is to tell stories. So, so then I might throw in a little motivational statement, I might say. And boy, was I motivated to get healed, because I wanted to go skiing with my son Dakota over Christmas. So there's a statement of motivation. And then I might say, so I went to see John Charles. So you see the plot? There's a plot forming. So I went to see John Charles, a healer.